3, 2, 1. Alright, first, before we get started, as you notice, I have dressed up in theme for our empire of the day, Russia, famous tropical empire. Oh, wait. So our last gunpowder empire is the Russian Empire. Now, the date is going to be critical to understand. It's going to be a tad confusing, so make sure you're listening very closely. Up here, I have 1682 through 1917. Now, the Russian Empire has actually been around a lot longer than that. We're going to talk about that in the origin and the rise. The key part of this date, 1682, is that this is when Peter the Great took over. Peter the Great is the person who is considered to have made Russia into a real empire, and then made into and used gunpowder weapons, making it one of our gunpowder empires. So it's important though to understand the changes Peter made. We have to understand what Russia was like before Peter the Great. So the first half of this lecture is going to be dedicated to origin, rise, and what Russia was like before Peter the Great. So the origin of Russia. Of course, there have been Slavic people, that's an ethnicity, Slavs, who have lived in Eastern Europe forever. And there's a lot of debate to the real origins of where the term Russia comes from. But Russia didn't exist as we know it today until the fall of the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols conquered from East Asia all the way into Eastern Europe real fast. I saw some of us say the Mongols conquered all of Europe. Be careful. Mongols only conquered Eastern Europe. I'll put up a map to show you. Cool. So, when the Mongols conquered Eastern Europe, though, they didn't care about it as much as they did the Middle East or Asia. Instead, they kind of viewed the Slavic people who lived there as like backwards people. There wasn't really much there for the Russians to even care about. So they used the Slavic people who lived there as tribute. Basically, all these little cities that were there in Eastern Europe were tribute states. They gave money and they paid taxes to the Mongols to basically be left alone. Well, what eventually happened is that when the Mongols eventually fell, you had the rise of a city, Moscow, called the Muscovite state, that started to conquer all the people around it, eventually forming a kingdom. This leads us to our before Peter the Great. Before Peter the Great, there's some key things we need to know about Russia. First, Russia is an Orthodox Christian country. What that means is that we have our versions of Christianity. We have Catholicism, which is the one that's in most of Europe at the time. And then we have Orthodox Christianity. Later, we're going to talk about Protestant version of Christianity, but we'll get to that. We have Orthodox Christianity. There's just two different types of Christianity. Earlier in history, Orthodox Christianity was centered in the Byzantine Empire. But as the Byzantine Empire began to weaken and eventually fall to the Ottoman Empire, the power of the Orthodox Church transferred over to Russia. And basically, Russia was known as, and what they wanted to be considered as, is this powerful empire at the center of religious figure, the Orthodox Church. Orthodox Church is led by someone called the Patriarch. So it's important to know that, kind of like with Catholics, where there's the Pope and a king, in Russia, there is that dual power structure of the leader of the Russian Empire and the Orthodox Church, and what they said was right. And at times they worked together, and at times they were opposites. So that leads us to Ivan the Great. Ivan the Great was the first real Russian ruler who started to gather in power. He started to really create what we would consider an empire. He also started to conquer eastward into Asia and start creating that huge Russian country that we know today. Ivan the Great also went by the term Tsar. Now, what does Tsar mean? If we think about Rome, because we dig down into Roman history, one of our most famous leaders and the person who made Rome into the Roman Empire is Julius Caesar. Now, what happens? Is she okay? Oh, God, Mika. What's important to remember about Europe is after all these European countries in the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages start to rise, every single one of them wants to basically get that glory and power that Rome represented. They wanted to kind of rebirth that Roman Empire. And so what you'll notice is that a lot of leaders take on names that are close to Caesar. For example, the German emperor calls himself the Kaiser, Caesar. In this case, the Russians are doing the same thing. Calling themselves the Tsar is a connection to Caesar and that Roman power. In fact, Russia even liked to consider itself as the third Rome, with Rome being the first, Byzantine being the second. They're the third Rome. They're the ones who are trying to regain that glory of the Roman Empire. That's all legitimizing them. The whole point of going through that name Tsar, connecting to Rome, is to try to make the leader seem powerful and someone that you should listen to. Last but not least, Eastern country. There's a dichotomy or a split in Russia that's really important to understand that still kind of affects their psyche or how they think about themselves today. Russia has always battled itself as being a distinctly Eastern Slavic country that does things their own way, they have their own culture, and wanting to be a part of Europe and be a part about Western Europe and consider themselves a Western European country. And so basically Russia goes through these ways where they want to be European, they want to act as European as possible, and then flowing back into, no, we're an Eastern country, we're a Slavic country, we have our own culture, and trying to balance that out. In this case, as an Eastern country, we also look at what Russia did when they started conquering eastward into Asia. Russia as an empire, when it conquered into that eastern area, is what we would consider very assimilatory. They viewed the people that they conquered as backwards, and as people that needed to be changed. So what happened is a few of the following things. First, how is the Russian Empire assimilatory to the people they conquered? First, their whole goal was trying to get wealth from them. So every single person they conquered had to pay tribute, or this large tax, to the Russian Empire. Second, the people who were conquered had to pledge complete loyalty to the Tsar as a way to kind of like centralize and like make that promise. Ooh, little Mika tail. Next, they were basically Russified, or they had to act Russian. They had to start speaking the Russian language. They had to wear Russian clothing. They had to convert to Orthodox Christianity as a way to try to like turn them into Russians. This was also made faster because many of them started to die from disease. These were people who were isolated, and as the Russians conquered and moved in, they were exposed to diseases that they'd never seen before and started to die. Very similar to the Native Americans when the Europeans showed up. Last but not least, many Russian people were given incentives to move and to colonize these areas, move east. And so people were naturally Russified as they lived with other Russians and had to copy their behaviors to have any sort of like respect or power. So Russia was very assimilatory in that way. Last time we think of this of Russia becoming an empire through conquest. What's an interesting idea that that's also important to understand with Russia is how they are an empire built on war. And you might say, well, every empire is built on war, but to Russia, it's a little bit different. What I mean by that is Russia is a state that is dedicated to always almost being at war. They were constantly fighting. Their entire society was dedicated to maintaining this war machine, this army that could continuously be fighting and proving the Russian worth and expanding. Not only that, since the Russian state was so huge, they're unique in how important their leader was. There's a bit. You could consider the Russian Tsar as one of the most autocratic and powerful leaders in the world. Almost all power flowed from him. And this is because, like, he was always at war. He was always fighting. And this expansion was heavily dedicated to his control of the army, which is only going to become greater once Peter the Great takes over. Guys, it's time for America's favorite game show. Name that Russian. All right, let's start it off. This first Russian, 5'8", moved here when he was 14. Can run a 40-second 40-yard dash. Loves arguing on the internet, and is into tech. My father! Yo, Our next Russian loves power, hates dissent, hacked America's elections, loves riding horses without a shirt on. That's right, it's Vladimir Putin! Please don't destroy me online! Yeah! Our last Russian, really strong, really tall, likes boxing. That's right, it's the Russian boxer from Rocky. That's it. Back to the lecture. Peter the Great. And this is why the date we start with is the date that Peter the Great takes over. Because we consider Russia as a gunpowder empire to happen because of Peter the Great. What's really important about Peter the Great is that one, he creates this idea of the Russian Empire, and two, he also starts one of Russia's first big pushes of Westernization. Remember, Westernization means, I'm sorry about my phone, guys. Just so popular. Westernization means copying European culture, ideas, technology, things like that. So when Peter the Great was growing up, Russia was in a very much Eastern idea. Like, they viewed themselves as a Slavic country that has its own culture, does things its own way. Peter the Great grew up, and he actually, got an education that's heavily based in Western European ideas. He was famous for hanging out in the German quarter of Moscow, the capital of Russia. He would hang out with a bunch of German people and learn about what they knew and things like that. He was also famous for around the age of when he got to teenager or early adulthood, he took a trip throughout Europe. He actually went incognito, which was kind of difficult because he was 6'8". But he basically didn't want to be known as royalty. He traveled around, he would work on the docks, he would talk to the common people, and he really wanted to get a sense of what Europe was all about. Once Peter the Great took over, is when Russia really starts to change. As he takes over, he is going to make a lot of huge changes. First, proof through war. Peter the Great took over in the time of war for Russia. They were fighting a lot of different wars, specifically with Sweden and other European countries. So Peter the Great proved his worth by winning these wars early on. And this was huge because Russia was considered still a pretty weak empire, just kind of like fringe country on the far part of Eastern Europe. Him winning these wars proved Russia's might and proved him as a leader. Once he won these wars, for one, it expanded Russia westward into Europe. It also put Russia kind of on the world stage. European countries started to notice Russia and went, wow, they're a legitimate power, someone we have to pay attention to. Next, and also, sorry, I want to add one more thing. Peter the Great also, and this is a continuity throughout time, is that Russia was constantly fighting other battles too. Russia was constantly fighting the Ottoman Empire, this battle between Christianity and Islam. They also had skirmishes with China and other Asian nations. So this constant push of like, Russia's always fighting, always trying to prove itself. Second, centralization. Peter the Great went through a huge stage of centralization, gathering even more power into himself. He did this through a lot of ways. I have some of them up here, but I'm also going to verbally mention some. First, the faith, Orthodox Christianity. As I talked about earlier, Russia had lived in this duality between the Tsar's power and the Patriarch's power. When Peter the Great took over, there's actually no Patriarch in power. The one who had been there had died. And usually the Russian Tsar had a say in who was going to be the next Patriarch. Or there are usually elections that put the Patriarch in power. And what Peter the Great did was actually, he did not allow a new Patriarch to get into power. Instead, the leadership became a series of councils. And the whole point behind this is that Peter the Great actually wanted the church to be weak. He did not want a separate power structure that could challenge him and his authority. And so he purposely kept the Christian church, the Christian Orthodox Church, weak. Second, he completely changed the structure of government. He got rid of a lot of the old systems of how Russia was run, and instead copied a lot of European systems of government, such as using ministries, and really focusing on the enlarging of the bureaucracy. So as he enlarged the bureaucracy, he made it so that, one, it was completely dependent on the leader, on him, the Tsar. There was a Senate that basically took all his declarations and figured out how it became policy and pushed it out. He also made sure that Russia was divided into many different zones or states that could be run by different smaller governmental systems. And so he tried to put in this a large European-style bureaucracy. Next, a merit system. So he did the merit system in two ways. One, in the army. Peter the Great made it so the army was no longer completely based on birth. For a long time, all Russian power came from your birth. If you were a nobility, you got a lot of advantages. Specifically, your nobility, it used to be that you would automatically be a general or commander in the army, or have a high-level position in the army. What Peter the Great does is he says, no, we are now, everyone's starting at the same level, and you earn your way up through the army. So while nobility would still start at a higher position than maybe a peasant, what it meant, though, was that a peasant, through really good work in the army, could rise up and even become a noble status through his service. It also made it so nobility had to earn their way to higher levels of power. This merit system also applied to government, as people had to get an education and then had to serve in lower levels of government and earn their way up instead of just being a noble and getting a high position in government. he made it so that there was what we call general conscription. Everyone could technically be part of the army. In fact, a lot of people were forced to serve in the army. This made the Russian army a lot larger, and it also made it so like the government was funding, providing this army, and it was completely just a part of the government. The government was raising up the army, paying for it, supplying it, things like that. So this created a huge army that he could use to keep his power. Last but not least, Peter the Great had a huge push of industry. He wanted people to come. He wanted these new industries, factories, production models. When I say factory, I don't mean electric factories yet, as we're going to talk about later. This wasn't necessarily industrialization, but like the production of these larger buildings that could produce a lot of items. He brought in basically foreigners to start these huge industries. These industries were almost completely dedicated to warfare. Remember, the Russian state was always at fighting, always proving that it was powerful. And so these industry people were brought in. Last but not least, I don't have it on here, is the use of foreigners. The Russian population as a whole was not very well educated. And so when Peter went, okay, I need to put in these new systems, these new ministries, these new factories, this new education system, this new army style, Peter the Great relied heavily on Western European people to come in and run these things. He was not afraid to have foreigners help run his government. He was not afraid to have foreigners run his army. He was not afraid to have foreigners run business. And this use of outside people to come in and kind of teach and show how these things worked allowed him to westernize a lot faster and basically become the Gunpowder Empire that we know today as the Russian Empire, one that would have a huge effect on Europe and the world in the upcoming generations and years. So that is the Russian Empire, and we're really focusing on before Peter the Great, not a Gunpowder Empire, but it's important to understand what Russia was like. After Peter the Great, we have it becoming a Gunpowder Empire, and we really need to understand how Peter the Great centralized power and changed Russia to become a Gunpowder Empire. Cut in, because I had to cut some things. Another way Peter the Great centralized Russia was when he was westernizing it, he forced all his nobility to act Western. What does that mean? All the nobility had to wear Western clothing. They all had to start learning French, which was considered the civilized language at the time, and speak French. And not only that, they also had to cut their beards. A part of Slavic culture and identity was these huge beards. The style at the time, though, I'm sure with Peter, the style at the time was less, almost clean shaven, maybe just a mustache. So he actually at times physically forced Russian nobility to shave their beards as a way to show like he has power over them and that they were truly going to become a Western European style people.